Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you've decided to join me today. Before we begin, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you enjoy the story, please consider liking the video. It really helps others find these fascinating slices of history. If you think someone else would find this story intriguing, feel free to share it with them. And of course, don't forget to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what you think about this unique piece of history we're about to explore. Now, as you get comfortable, let me invite you to journey with me back to Victorian London in 1857. A city of contrasts where the wealthy lived in splendor, surrounded by opulence, while much of the population faced severe poverty, overcrowded living conditions, and long hours of grueling labor. In the heart of the city, where the fog thickens and the scent of coal smoke fills the air, was a world few dared to acknowledge, a world that existed just beneath the surface, often out of sight, but never out of mind. This was the world of women who worked in brothels. At first glance, it may seem like a grim and sordid topic, one many would prefer to avoid. But tonight, we're going to dive deep into that very world and uncover the stories of the women who lived and worked there, stories that are often left untold. You'll meet Mary, a young woman living in a Victorian brothel, and through her we'll uncover a hidden history of survival resilience and strength. Mary's story might not be what you expect. She didn't fall into this life through some tragic tale of kidnapping or coercion. Her path to the brothel was more mundane, yet no less profound a reflection of the limited choices available to women at the time. Mary was once a seamstress working tirelessly in a poorly lit workshop for long hours, her hands sore and cracked from constant use of the needle, earning barely enough to survive. Despite her skill and dedication, her work provided little beyond the bare minimum food shelter and an ever-present sense of worry about the next day's survival. Like so many women in Victorian society, Mary Sowry found herself trapped in a cycle of poverty with few options for change. The work was exhausting, the pay was meager, and there was always a sense that it might never get better. But for Mary, the turning point came when the harsh realities of her seamstress life became too much to bear. She was offered an opportunity to move to a brothel, where the conditions, though far from ideal, promised something better: more money, more food, and a warm bed. At least it seemed like a way out of her struggle. So, with a heavy heart and a resigned sense of survival, she made the difficult decision to join the women in the brothel. It wasn't a choice made lightly, and it wasn't a step she took without understanding the consequences. But in that moment of desperation, she saw no other way forward. But Mary's story is not simply one of hardship. As we journey through her day, we will discover how she navigated this complex and often misunderstood world. The brothel was in many ways its own microcosm of society, a place where women not only worked, but also formed relationships, created bonds, and found ways to survive within a system that sought to strip them of their dignity. Through Mary's eyes, we'll witness the realities of life behind closed doors, the routines, the quiet acts of rebellion, the moments of connection, and the constant effort to retain some semblance of control over her own fate. Now you might be wondering, what was it really like to be a woman working in a Victorian brothel? It's easy to imagine such a life as one filled with only misery and exploitation. And while there certainly were plenty of challenges, there were also unexpected moments of camaraderie, humanity, and even small luxuries that made survival possible. The women who worked in brothels had to be both survivors and performers. They had to live up to the expectations placed on them while navigating the physical and emotional demands of their work. The brothel where Mary worked was not the worst in London, but it certainly wasn't one of the high-class establishments either. It was in a working-class neighborhood where men, often businessmen, on extended lunch breaks would come to seek escape from their daily lives. These men, like most of society, saw the women in the brothel as little more than commodities. Yet despite this, the women in these houses created their own rules, their own system, and their own strategies for survival. Mary learned quickly that the brothel was not just a place for physical labor. It was a place where the women had to play their part in a carefully crafted illusion, giving their clients an experience that wasn't just about sex, but about escape and fantasy. Mary's day would begin early, just as it had in her seamstress days. The room where she slept was cold, the thin, woolen blanket offering little warmth. The walls were covered in peeling floral wallpaper, and the room itself smelled faintly of lavender water, meant to mask the more unpleasant smells of coal smoke and the damp of London. The bed she shared with another woman was small, and the mattress made of horsehair was uncomfortable. But it was what she had, and like so many women in her position, she had learned to make do. After waking, Mary would begin her morning routine, a wash in cold water, followed by a quick change into her simple daytime dress. The morning was the only time the women had to themselves, time for basic hygiene to prepare for the work ahead. And yet, even in these moments, Mary knew she had to be vigilant. Life in the brothel was never truly her own. She was constantly aware of her role and the expectations placed on her. But the brothel wasn't all work. There were small luxuries that made the life a little easier. Meals were regular, unlike the sparse, often rotten food she had eaten as a seamstress. There was also medical care. The brothel was run by a Madam Mrs. Cartwright, who ensured that the women had access to health checks and treatments when necessary. Mary would often reflect on these small comforts, understanding that without them, her survival would have been far more difficult. Still, no amount of food or medical care could erase the emotional and psychological toll of the work. Each day brought its own set of challenges, and Mary knew that the brothel was a place where women came and went. Some left for better jobs, others disappeared due to illness, and some were sent away due to exhaustion or failure to meet expectations. But despite the harshness of the world she lived in, Mary found moments of connection with the other women. They formed bonds, sisterhoods built on shared experience. They helped each other get through the hardest days, offering support in the face of a world that judged them at every turn. As we move through Mary's day, we'll explore the interactions she has with her clients, the other women in the brothel, and the routines that keep her grounded. We'll see how she navigates the delicate balance between providing a service and maintaining her sense of self, the small rebellions that allow her to feel human in a dehumanizing world. The brothel was a place of performance, and every woman in it had to learn her role. Some clients wanted more conversation than intimacy, while others preferred to escape into a fantasy. For Mary, understanding what each client sought was key to surviving this world. Yet while her work required her to play a part, it did not completely strip her of her identity. She found ways to maintain a sense of control, to preserve her humanity, amidst the transactional nature of her job. But the brothel was also a place of stark realities. It was a place where women were constantly reminded of their status in society, where the price of survival was often too high. Mary was no stranger to this reality. She had seen other women come and go, some leaving with a sense of escape, others leaving because they had been broken by the work. She knew that this life could wear a person down, but she also knew that without it, she would have had no other options. As the day wore on, Mary's interactions with the clients varied from polite but brief encounters with businessmen to longer, more intimate exchanges with those who sought comfort beyond what was expected. She had learned that her work was not just about physical intimacy. It was about providing something more. Whether it was companionship, an escape from loneliness, or simply the fantasy of a different life, Mary played her part. Each client offered her a glimpse into another world, a world where she might have been able to choose her fate. But for now, that world remained out of reach. And yet, despite the emotional toll of the work, there were moments of connection. Some clients were kind, others indifferent, but Mary found solace in the small, fleeting moments when she was treated as more than just a commodity. These moments, though brief, kept her grounded and reminded her that she was more than the role society forced her to play. As we continue with Mary's story, we'll explore the rhythms of the brothel, its routines, its rituals, and its quiet moments of defiance. We'll see how the women who worked there created a system to survive, finding small victories amidst the hardships. Mary's story is not just about surviving in a brothel. It's about finding strength, building connections, and preserving a sense of self in the face of adversity. So, sit back, relax, and join me as we follow Mary through a day in her life. You'll learn about the trials she faces, the choices she makes, and the resilience she discovers within herself. Along the way, you might just gain a new understanding of the women who lived in the shadows of Victorian society and how they navigated a world that often offered them no choice at all. Before we continue, remember to like, share, and comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Mary's story and what it reveals about life in Victorian London. Thank you for being here, and let's dive into the story. The day had only just begun, and already the cold of the morning crept into the room. It was just past 5 o'clock. Perhaps 6 time was not marked in any precise way here. The dim light that filtered through the half-drawn curtains cast a pale glow on the uneven walls. The floral wallpaper faded and peeling at the edges. The air smelled faintly of lavender water, a feeble attempt to mask the mustiness of the room, but it only made the scent more muddled, the faint perfume mixing with the stale air like a half-hearted gesture. Mary lay still for a moment, eyes closed, letting the silence of the early morning wash over her. The city was still asleep for the most part, with only the distant hum of the street beginning to stir. There was the occasional rattle of carts in the distance, the clang of horses' hooves on cobblestone, but for now, it was a quiet moment, a rare pause before the day's duties would demand their due. She felt the weight of the mattress beneath her, hard, uneven, the springs creaking in protest with the slightest movement. It was a horsehair mattress, old and worn, its contents compressed and misshapen by years of use. Not the kind of bed one might find in a fine house, but the kind that felt more like a surface to endure than a place for rest. The thin blanket she had pulled around her shoulders offered little warmth, and the cold of the floor seeped through the fabric of her nightdress, making her skin prick with discomfort. The room was cold, so cold that Mary could see her breath in small puffs as she exhaled. It was the sort of cold that settled deep into your bones, not merely a chill in the air, but a weight upon the body, a reminder that warmth was a luxury not afforded to her here. The small fire had long since gone out. Out the embers, nothing but ash now, and the coal for the hearth was rationed. She would have to make do until Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, came in later to stir the fires to life. It wasn't the first time she had woken in this way. No, this was the life she had come to know. Cold mornings, uncomfortable beds, the persistent smell of industrial London seeping in through the cracks of the house. The faint smell of coal smoke filled the air, a reminder of the city's endless churn, its ceaseless hunger for energy. It clung to everything, from the walls to the clothes to the very air that they breathed. It was a grim, steady presence, much like the life Mary had found herself living. She shifted slightly, feeling the cold floor press against her bare feet, and stretched her legs, feeling the stiffness in her joints. The movement was a familiar ache, one that came from long hours spent sitting, standing, working. Her body was accustomed to it, used to the wear and tear of the work she did. Her hands, once soft and delicate, were now calloused. Her fingers used to the needle, the fabric, the daily grind. Yet there were moments like these early mornings when the pain felt a little more acute, a little more noticeable, when the weight of everything settled down like a heavy cloak. But Mary did not dwell on the discomfort for long. She had learned not to. Resignation had crept into her bones, just as surely as the cold, and in time, she had grown used to the harshness of her surroundings. She no longer thought of a life that might have been different, a life that might have included a warm bed, fresh sheets, the comfort of a proper home. No, that life had long slipped away out of reach, like a dream one could not catch, no matter how hard one tried. This life, the one she had now, was the one she must live. The bed was small, just a narrow cot pushed against the wall, and Mary could feel the woman in the other bed stirring slightly. The light rustling of blankets, the soft murmur of breath as the other girl shifted in her sleep. Mary glanced over briefly, her eyes landing on Lily, her roommate. She was younger than Mary, perhaps by a few years, her fair hair tangled in the sheets. Lily was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Mary turned her gaze back to the ceiling, the cold, grayish light creeping across the room. Outside, the city was waking up. She could hear the faint sounds of life beginning to stir, the rattle of cartwheels, the clop of horses' hooves, the early cries of street vendors calling out their wares. There was a constant hum to London's mornings, a rhythm that never quite ceased, even at this hour. It was an odd thing. She thought how life went on. Even in the darkest moments, even in the most uncomfortable corners of existence, the world continued to turn. People got up, went to work, lived their lives despite it all. Mary could hear the sounds of London's busy streets, even in the quiet of the early morning, when the house was still, when the other girls were yet to begin their routines. She could already feel the weight of the day ahead. The brothel was quiet now, but it would not stay that way for long. By mid-morning, the regulars would begin to arrive. Businessmen, sailors, men with money to spare, each one seeking a different kind of escape. And Mary, like the others, would slip into the role that had become so familiar: the courteous smile, the polite words, the body performing its duties. There were few breaks in the schedule. Each day blended into the next, the same patterns, the same motions day after day. But for now, in the stillness of the morning, there was nothing to do but get up. She could hear the occasional creak of the house, settling the distant thud of footsteps on the stairs as Mrs. Winters went about her duties. The house was waking up just as the city was, and it would soon be time to rise and begin again. The first task of the day, washing her face with cold water, feeling the shock of it as it woke her senses. Then dressing slowly, methodically, in the simple worn clothes that had become her daily uniform. There were no fine silks or soft lace here, no delicate ribbons or intricate gowns to admire in the mirror. The clothes were plain, nothing more than practical garments meant to serve their purpose. A faded cotton dress, a woolen shawl for warmth, and the simple shoes that had seen better days. She dressed quickly, the familiar motions easy and automatic, and when she finished, she moved to the small table by the window where a chipped ceramic pitcher of cold water sat. It had a thin layer of ice on the top, the chill cutting through her skin as she splashed her face. The water was bracing sharp, and it woke her in a way nothing else could. Mary stood for a moment, feeling the coldness settle into her skin, the fresh shock of water on her face. It made her feel momentarily awake, as if the morning could somehow be different today. But that thought passed as quickly as it came. There was no real change, no sudden shift in her reality. She had learned not to expect it. After a few moments, she turned away from the window and took a long look around the room. The familiar sight of the peeling wallpaper, the worn furniture, the cold, uninviting walls, this was her life as much as she hated to admit it. She had long since stopped dreaming of a different life, one where she might find joy or comfort. Those dreams too had faded like the memory of a far-off place that no longer felt real. Lily shifted in her bed, letting out a soft sigh. Mary glanced over at her again, noting the way her roommate's long hair fell across the pillow in tangled waves. There was something tender in the sight, something that reminded Mary of the girl she used to be, young, hopeful, full of dreams about what her life might one day become. But that version of herself felt so far away now, like a character in a story long forgotten. The other girls in the house would soon be stirring as well. By now, they were all used to the early mornings, to the quiet rhythm of the brothel before the day truly began. Mrs. Winters would be moving about, setting the house in order, preparing for the arrival of the first customers. There was little time for anything other than the work. No time for sleep, no time for rest. The days stretched on, and though Mary had become accustomed to it, there were moments like these in the soft gray morning when the weight of it all felt a little heavier. Still, she got up, moving through the motions. She dressed in the plain, simple dress, the only clothes she owned, and wrapped the woolen shawl around her shoulders. She moved toward the small wardrobe where her clothes were neatly folded. There was nothing extravagant about them, but they were functional, and that was enough. In the quiet of the early morning, with the distant noise of the city beginning to rise, Mary prepared herself for the day ahead. A day of work, a day of service, a day in which she would slip into her role as easily as she slipped into her worn dress. But for now, she allowed herself a moment, a brief pause, a quiet breath before the day began. It was fleeting, but it was hers. And so the day started, just as it always did. The cold mornings, the hard bed, the dull scent of lavender water, trying in vain to mask the reality. And through it all, Mary endured. There was no other choice. This was her life now. The city was waking up, and so too would she. The routine was relentless, and there was no stopping it. But as the cold water splashed on her skin, and the first rays of light began to filter into the room, she was ready to begin again. She could not change the world around her, but she could face another day of it, one step at a time. And with that, she moved forward. The room was small, not much more than a cramped space where two women shared a bed. Their fates tangled together, yet divided by more than just the narrowness of the cot. Mary's eyes fluttered open, the dull light of the early morning creeping around the edges of the curtains. She shifted slightly, her body stiff and aching, feeling the cold of the floor through the thin fabric of her nightdress. Beside her, Lily lay sleeping, her breath soft and even. The younger woman was curled up tightly beneath the blanket, her fair hair spilling across the pillow, in tangled waves still untouched by the day's demands. For a moment, Mary simply watched her, the quiet warmth of the scene contrasting with the chill of the room. The house was still, save for the occasional sound of footsteps on the stairs or the distant creak of the old timbers. This moment, these few minutes before the world fully awakened, was rare, one of the only times Mary could forget the harshness of her circumstances, even if only for a breath. Though Mary had been sharing this room with Lily for nearly a year now, the space between them was always there. They were both workers in the same brothel, each woman doing what was necessary to survive. Their lives were intertwined, their fates often bound by the same struggle for survival. Yet in the cold, dim room, there was little conversation, and even less understanding of one another's burdens. There was camaraderie, certainly a mutual recognition of the weight of their work. But there was also a delicate competition, a silent awareness that their worth was measured in much the same way. Their youth, their health, their beauty. These things mattered in the house just as much as the work they performed. Mary had seen it all in her time here. She had been at the brothel for nearly 2 years now, long enough to watch others come and go, their paths often determined by forces beyond their control. Some had found better places to work, a higher position in the world. Some had returned to the streets, slipping back into the poverty they had tried so desperately to escape. And some had succumbed to illness, their bodies worn down by the demands of the job, their lives slipping away quietly unnoticed by all but the girls who had shared their beds. There was a constant cycle of life and death in this place, a cycle that seemed to repeat itself without end. It was a grim reality, but Mary had learned not to dwell on it. She had no choice but to endure. There was little room for sentiment in this world. The house was cold, its walls thin and worn, but the work it demanded was as constant as the clock's ticking. The girls were expected to be up and ready even before the first rays of sunlight pierced the misty air of London. The routine was rigid. There was no room for deviation. The day would start with the same ritual washing, dressing, preparing, then slipping into the role they all played day after day. Mary stretched her legs, the muscles stiff from the cold, and swung them over the side of the bed. The floorboards were hard and unforgiving beneath her feet, sending a jolt of discomfort through her joints. She glanced over at Lily once more before standing, noting the soft rise and fall of her chest. It was hard to imagine that Lily, so young and full of life, would soon be doing the same work Mary had done for years. The thought of it made Mary's heart heavy, but she quickly dismissed it. The cycle would continue as it always had. She stood and walked to the small table by the window, where a chipped ceramic pitcher sat, its contents pale and cold. The water inside had a thin layer of ice, its surface frozen solid from the night before. It was a harsh reminder that warmth was not something the house afforded. Mary had grown used to the shock of it, though. The cold water was an old friend by now, unforgiving but necessary. She reached for the pitcher, the cold ceramic sending a shiver through her fingertips. With a quiet sigh, she broke the thin sheet of ice with her finger, sending the water splashing lightly across the basin. Her breath caught at the sudden cold as she cupped her hands and splashed the water over her face, feeling the sharp sting of it against her skin. The shock was always jarring, a quick and sudden reminder of the world she lived in. But it was also refreshing, clearing the fog from her mind as she blinked, her breath steadying as the cold water revived her senses. She lingered for a moment at the basin, letting the sensation of cold water on her skin ground her. The air in the room was crisp, and she could see the faint mist of her own breath rising before her face. For a few seconds, she let herself be still, letting the reality of the morning settle in. There was something almost peaceful about these moments of quiet. The world outside was just beginning to stir, and inside the brothel, she was alone with her thoughts. She did not have time to dwell for long, however. The routine had already begun, the day already set in motion. After another breath, she took a rough towel from the small shelf beside the table and dabbed her face dry, the scratchy cloth pulling at her skin as it absorbed the water. The sensation was almost comforting in its own way. She had learned not to expect softness in this life. The world she inhabited was one of sharp edges, cold mornings, hard floors, stiff linens, but it was also a world she had come to know. The discomfort was familiar now, and in its own way, it had become a part of her. There was no room for softness here, only resilience. And Mary had learned to be resilient. Once dry, she turned toward the bed and began to dress. The woolen shawl was the first thing she reached for, pulling it tightly around her shoulders to ward off the chill in the air. It was a simple garment, far from the luxurious silks of the upper classes, but it was warm enough. Her dress followed next, a faded cotton number that had seen better days. There were no fine gowns or elegant trimmings here, only the simple clothing necessary for work. Her fingers worked quickly, as if the motions of dressing were as much a part of her as the air she breathed. She was methodical, each movement automatic, honed by years of repetition. Her shoes were next worn and scuffed, but functional. She could not afford the luxury of new things, nor did she expect them. The shoes, like everything else in her life, were simply tools for the day's work. She glanced once more at Lily, who was still sleeping, her body curled into the blankets, her face soft in its slumber. It would not be long before the other girls would stir, each one beginning their own day in their own way. They all moved through the same motions, the same routine, but no two girls were the same. Mary stood for a moment, her hand resting on the chair where her shawl hung. She let her gaze drift to the small window where the pale light had now grown brighter, the world outside waking in earnest. A faint noise rose from the streets, horses' hooves, clattering against cobblestones, the chatter of early vendors calling out their wares. London, as ever, was full of sound and movement, a city alive in its endless pursuit of progress. The silence of the room, however, remained unbroken. She felt a brief wave of loneliness wash over her, but it was a fleeting thing, quickly drowned by the knowledge that there was no time for such thoughts. She had work to do. The brothel, like the rest of the city, had its own rhythms, its own set of expectations, and those expectations would not wait. She took a final glance at Lily, noting the way her chest rose and fell, the faint warmth of the girl's presence in the small room. It was a reminder of the fragile nature of their lives here, how their fates were constantly tied to one another, even if they did not always acknowledge it. For all their differences, all the silent competition between them, they were bound by the same reality, by the same set of rules. With that thought, Mary turned away and walked to the door. The house was beginning to stir now. Mrs. Winters, no doubt, was already at work, and the other girls would soon be up and preparing themselves for the day's clients. Mary paused at the door, her hand resting on the worn wood. Another day, another cycle, the same motions, the same steps. She knew what lay ahead. More work, more customers, the constant hum of life in the brothel. There was no room for doubt in this life, only the need to survive, to endure. With one final breath, she opened the door and stepped out into the narrow hallway, ready to begin another day. Before she came to this life in the brothel, Mary had worked as a seamstress. The quiet rhythm of her fingers, moving swiftly over the fabric, stitching and mending with practiced precision, had once been her life. The job suited her. She was quick with a needle, her hands nimble and skilled, her eye for detail sharp. In a different world, she might have been proud of her craft, the neatness of the seams. She created the careful stitching that held the fabric together. But this was not a world that rewarded such skills. No, this was Victorian London, a place where many women like her labored for hours on end and yet remained invisible, their work as mundane and unnoticed as the dust that gathered in the corners of the rooms they worked in. The work was endless. The hours were long, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. The light was poor, the air thick with the dust of cotton and wool. The room she worked in was dim, its only window high and narrow, allowing little light to seep through the grime that coated the glass. In the winter months, the cold would bite through the walls and seep into her bones, making the work even harder. But there was no choice. She could not afford to rest, not for a moment. Her wages were pitiful, barely enough to cover her rent, let alone feed herself. There were times when she went without food for days, her stomach aching with hunger, but she pressed on. It was the only way to survive. She had no family to fall back on, no one to help her when things became too much. The streets outside were full of women, just like her women, with nimble hands, but empty stomachs. Their lives were all the same, drained by the endless work and the meager rewards it offered. They were invisible to the world, their struggles unnoticed, their hopes buried beneath the weight of survival. In the cold winter months, her fingers would often bleed the constant rubbing of needle against fabric wearing away the skin. She would press on through it, wrapping her hands in cloth when the blood became too much. It didn't matter, there was always more work to do. She could not afford to take a day off, not when the rent was due, not when the next commission had to be finished. Her body was a tool, and she used it until it broke, only to push it a little further the next day. The work itself was soul-sucking. The fabric, the needle, the hours of repetition, it became a blur, a never-ending cycle of mending and stitching with little reward. In those moments, when her mind wandered from the task at hand, she would often think of what lay beyond the walls of the small room. There had to be more than this. She had heard whispers of other women, friends, acquaintances who had left the sewing rooms, who had moved on to something better, something easier. But she could not see a way out. No matter how fast her fingers moved, how clean her seams were, the wages never matched the effort. And then, one evening, the weight of it all became too much. She sat at her sewing machine, her fingers stiff from the cold, her eyes heavy from lack of sleep, and she realized that this was it. She was trapped in this cycle of poverty, and no amount of work, no matter how diligently she applied herself, would ever set her free. The dream of escaping the drudgery of her life had grown dimmer with each passing year. She had been working for what felt like an eternity, and yet nothing had changed. She was still poor, still struggling to make ends meet. The realization hit her like a cold slap in the face. She could not escape the cycle. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much effort she put into her craft, she would always be bound by the same harsh reality. It was then, in that moment of despair, that she heard the knock on her door. It was Jane, a woman she had known briefly from the workrooms, a woman who had moved on to a different life. Jane had always been one of those women whose beauty shone through, even in the most unflattering of circumstances. She had a kind smile, and her eyes had a warmth that could make anyone feel at ease. She was the type of woman who seemed to glide through life no matter what challenges it threw her way. Mary had seen Jane a few months prior, when she had been just another face in the crowd of women who worked alongside her in the grimy rooms. But now, Jane stood before her, dressed differently, her face flush with health and energy. There was something about her that felt different, something that suggested she had found a way out of the misery that Mary was still trapped in. "Mary, you look terrible," Jane had said, with a half smile, her voice laced with sympathy. Mary had tried to hide her weariness behind a tired smile, but there was no fooling Jane. They had exchanged pleasantries, the usual small talk, before Jane told her of her own escape from the drudgery of seamstress work. She had found a way out, a way to leave behind the cold, the long hours, the constant hunger. She had come to offer Mary an opportunity. "There's a place," Jane had said softly, glancing over her shoulder as though to make sure no one was listening. It's not like here. The work is different. You'd make in a night what you make in a week sewing Mary. And there's food, a proper bed. It's a decent place, really. The madam's strict but fair. No one's going to hurt you. It's just, well, it's different, but it's a way out. You'd have more time to yourself to rest, to not feel like you're starving all the time. The words felt like a lifeline. It wasn't much, but it was more than what she had now. The idea of making as much in one night as she would in a week of sewing seemed impossible. How could it be so? How could such a life be anything but degrading? Yet, in the deepest part of her heart, the part she rarely acknowledged, Mary knew she was already desperate enough to consider it. The decision weighed heavily on her mind, even as she listened to Jane's promises of a warmer room, better food, and a chance to escape the constant grind of her current existence. She had spent too long thinking about escape, dreaming of something better. And now, it was within reach, though the price would be steep. The thought of the work, the nature of it, still haunted her, though. She had heard the rumors, the whispers about women who had gone down this path. Some came back broken, others disappeared altogether. There was no illusion that the work was easy, no suggestion that it wouldn't cost something both in body and in soul. But Jane's words resonated in her ears, and the promise of warmth, of being able to eat without fear of where the next meal would come from, was a balm to her aching heart. The choice was not a simple one, but in that moment, with the cold floor beneath her feet and the weight of her circumstances pressing in on her, it felt like the only choice. Mary stood still for a long moment, the room suddenly too small, too suffocating. She looked out of the small window at the gray sky, the dullness of the world outside matching the gray emptiness that had settled in her chest. The weight of her future felt like a burden she had carried for far too long, and now Jane had come to offer her something that felt like a way out. "All right," Mary whispered the words, barely escaping her lips. "I'll go." Jane smiled, a look of relief passing across her face. She had been waiting for Mary's answer, and now it was here. There was no turning back, no escaping the consequences of her decision. But there was also a spark of hope, the smallest glimmer of possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could escape the life that had consumed her. And so with that, Mary stepped into a new world, one that would demand much from her, but one that promised the chance for something different, something more than the weary, unchanging life she had known as a seamstress. The brothel, for all its harshness, was also a place of strange bonds, a place where friendships were born not out of choice, but necessity, the kind of bonds that formed in the quiet corners of shared hardship. Mary had learned this quickly. Though the work was demanding and often lonely, the women she worked with became in many ways her only companions, her only family. Their fates, for better or worse, were intertwined in ways that no one could have predicted. Each one of them had their own reasons for being here, reasons not always spoken aloud, but understood all the same. There was camaraderie, yes, but also a sharp undercurrent of competition. The brothel was not a place where many women flourished. It was a place where only the sharpest, the most resilient, or the luckiest could hold their place for any length of time. Yet despite the rivalry, despite the constant reminder that each woman's survival depended on her ability to maintain a certain standard of beauty, health, and charm, there was also a deep empathy between them. They knew the weight of the work, the toll it took on a woman's body, her soul, her very sense of self. Mary had become close to a few of them over the years. Lily, her roommate, was one of the first women she had connected with. Lily had been here only a short time, yet she seemed to understand the brothel's rhythms as if she had been born into it. She had arrived from a factory in Manchester where the constant noise of looms had left her with partial hearing loss in one ear. Her skin, though pale from years of labor, still held traces of youth and softness that Mary envied. It was Lily who had first shown Mary how to navigate the unspoken rules of their new world, how to balance the needs of the clients with the need to protect herself, how to smile even when she wanted to curl up and disappear, how to dress, how to behave, how to be the woman they all needed to be in order to survive. In the beginning, Lily had been a lifeline, a steady presence in a world that often felt like it was spinning out of control. The other women came and went. Some would find other brothels higher-paying clients, or in rare cases leave the trade altogether, sometimes to be lost to illness or despair. Others fell ill in body and mind, retreating from the demands of the house, never to be seen again. It was a cycle that Mary had become all too familiar with. The faces changed, but the work remained the same. And yet, within this constant churn, there was a kind of quiet strength that came from knowing the women who shared the space with her. The shared struggles were not always talked about openly, but they were always there, present in the small, simple acts of kindness that passed between them. A shared meal, a word of encouragement, a moment of laughter. These were the things that made it possible to endure the hardship, to face another day, another client, another night. Lily's advice had been invaluable. She had told Mary to guard her emotions carefully, not to let the work seep into her soul too deeply. The clients, they were nothing but a passing shadow. The real work, the real challenge, was to maintain one's sense of self, to not lose the person underneath all the performance. Lily had learned this the hard way, and she passed on her wisdom as if it were a secret treasure. It was through Lily's guidance that Mary learned to navigate the delicate balance between being a woman and being a commodity. Though they had become close, there was still an unspoken understanding between them, a line that neither crossed a distance maintained. Their friendship, while deep, was still bound by the unyielding walls of the brothel. They had learned to support each other without expecting too much, without asking for more than the fleeting moments of connection that their work allowed. This was the world they lived in, and they had learned how to survive within it. It was an understanding that extended beyond Lily. Mary had formed quiet friendships with the other women, bonds that were forged in shared hardship and silent understanding. Emily, the small blonde with a quick laugh and a kind heart, had become someone Mary could confide in. They shared little more than fleeting conversations in the early mornings before the work began, but those moments were precious. Then there was Sarah, who was older than the rest, nearly 30, with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense attitude. She had worked in the brothel for longer than Mary, and she was the one who helped keep the house running smoothly. Sarah had an uncanny ability to keep everything in order, from the finances to the flow of clients, and her advice on managing both the business and the emotional demands of the work was invaluable. But it was Lily who had become her closest ally, her most trusted friend. They had shared enough to know each other's stories, though unspoken, and both understood that the other carried the same quiet burden. They did not speak often of their past lives, of the lives they had before this place had swallowed them up, but when they did, it was with a sense of shared grief, a sorrow for the dreams they had once held, dreams that had long since faded into the shadows. Together, they had learned the art of surviving in the brothel. Lily had shown Mary how to make the most of each client, how to read their needs before they even spoke. She had taught her the subtle nuances of charm, how to smile just the right way, how to position herself in a way that felt both alluring and unattainable. She taught her, too, how to retreat inwardly to create a distance between herself and the work. It was a skill Mary had honed over the months, one she had learned quickly, for survival demanded it. There were nights, of course, when it was harder than others. The demands of the clients, their incessant needs, would wear her down. But through it all, Mary had learned to take refuge in the friendships she had formed with the other women. They were her support, her lifeline in a world that seemed to demand everything from them. It was through them that Mary found moments of lightness, moments of shared laughter, even if only in the quiet hours before the work began. As the days passed, the other women continued to come and go. Some found themselves leaving the brothel, moving on to better places, while others faded into the background, consumed by the demands of their work or lost to illness. But no matter who was present or who had gone, the bond between the women remained. They all knew that the work they did, the work that had brought them here, could break them if they let it. But as long as they had each other, they would survive. The brothel was not an easy place to live, but the women had found a way to endure. They found strength in one another, solace in their shared experience. And though their lives were defined by the work they did, it was the friendships they had formed in this harsh world that made it possible to carry on. Mary could not have asked for a better companion than Lily. She had been the one to show her the way, to guide her through the minefield of the brothel's world. But Lily's advice was not the only thing Mary had learned. She had learned, too, that in the end, it was not just about surviving the work. It was about surviving each other. And in that shared survival, they found a kind of quiet peace, a peace that helped them face another day, another client, another night in the brothel. As Mary moved through her days, she found herself growing more and more accustomed to the rhythms of the brothel. She had learned how to navigate the complexities of the work, how to give without giving too much. She had learned how to smile, how to laugh, how to be the woman her clients expected her to be. But through it all, she knew that it was the friendships she had forged with the other women that made it bearable. It was their strength, their shared understanding that allowed her to continue. In the quiet moments when the house was still, she would remember those bonds. They were her reminder that she was not alone in this life, that the work they did was not just a solitary task, but a shared experience, one that connected them all. And so, each day, Mary continued surviving, learning, living, and finding in the women around her the strength to carry on. Through their friendship, through their support, she had come to understand that survival in this world was not just about enduring the work. It was about enduring it together. The brothel was a place of unspoken order, a world governed by routines and rituals, each one carefully constructed to maintain a delicate balance. The house ran like clockwork, its workings hidden behind the faded curtains and thin walls, its structure known only to those who lived within it. The women who worked there moved through the days with practiced grace, their tasks assigned, their roles clear. There was no room for deviation in this life. The routine was as constant as the ebb and flow of the tide. The day began early, long before the first client arrived. The women were expected to rise with the dawn to prepare the house for the day ahead. The work, though, not physically demanding, in the same way as the evening's duties, was essential to the smooth running of the establishment. The brothel, after all, was not just a place for clients to indulge their desires. It was a business one that required meticulous care and attention to detail. Each woman had her assigned task. Some were responsible for cleaning the common areas, dusting the furniture, sweeping the floors, and ensuring that everything was in order. The rooms, though small, needed to be kept spotless, the beds made with precision, the linens fresh. Every corner had to be tended to every surface polished. The smell of lavender, that ever-present reminder of the brothel's attempt at cleanliness, hung faintly in the air as the women worked quietly alongside one another. Mary, as usual, was tasked with dusting the parlor. The room was one of the largest in the house where clients were first received. It was decorated in heavy, dark velvet curtains and plush, worn furniture. The paintings on the walls were tasteful landscapes, classical scenes, nothing too provocative. A few of the women had remarked in quieter moments that the room could have been mistaken for that of a respectable house. Nothing in it shouted the nature of its purpose. It was a place where illusion was cultivated, where the lines between fantasy and reality could blur. The morning passed in familiar, rhythmic motions. Mary dusted the mantels and polished the glassware, paying special attention to the crystal glasses that sat on the small bar in the corner of the room. She knew well enough that it was these small details that set their brothel apart from others. There was a care in the way they maintained the house, a professionalism that made clients feel more at ease. It was why some men returned here, time and time again, preferring the comfort and discretion of this house over others. The women were well-groomed, well-fed, and treated with respect, and the house itself was a quiet sanctuary from the hustle and chaos of the streets outside. After the morning chores, the women would bathe. It was a luxury that was afforded to them, and it was one they appreciated, even though the water was rarely warm enough to soothe aching muscles. The baths were often quick, the water often cold, but they were necessary. The physical demands of the work required that they remain healthy and presentable, and the baths were a reminder of that. Each woman took her turn. The copper tub set up in the kitchen, steam rising from the water, as the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, ensured that the process ran smoothly. For Mary, the bathing routine was a small but significant ritual. She had grown accustomed to the cold shock of the water, the way it made her skin tingle and tighten with the chill. It was a moment of quiet, of solitude, before the day truly began. She would wash her body with the soap provided, the scent of lavender mingling with the natural scent of her skin. The water was harsh, but it was clean, and it was a small luxury in the midst of a life that often felt devoid of such comforts. It was during these moments, in the quiet of the morning, that Mary allowed herself to reflect. The brothel, for all its faults, had a certain order to it. The women knew what was expected of them, and there was comfort in that predictability. The work was hard, yes, but it was also a means of survival. And survival, she had learned, was something to be treasured. The brothel was not just a place of work. It was also a place of refuge. The women were given a roof over their heads, meals to eat, and medical care when necessary. These small luxuries, though easily taken for granted by those who had never known hunger or illness, were what kept the women going. They had all learned to make the most of these comforts, to appreciate the things that others might overlook. A warm meal, a soft bed, the chance to rest, these were the things that allowed them to endure. The house itself was well maintained, a place that felt more like a home than a mere business. Mrs. Cartwright, the madam, was strict but fair, and her sense of order pervaded the entire building. She ensured that the women were cared for, that they had what they needed to stay healthy and perform their duties. There was no room for neglect in this place. Nothing was left to chance. The women were not just workers. They were valued. They were essential to the success of the brothel. And in turn, the brothel took care of them in ways that many would not expect. But it was the small personal details that made all the difference. The women were given regular medical checks, a luxury not afforded to those in other brothels. The doctor visited once a week, checking for any signs of illness or infection. Disease, after all, was a constant threat. It was a reminder of their vulnerability, of the risks they took with each client. Mary had long since learned to be vigilant, to listen to her body, to notice when something felt wrong. The examinations were a necessary part of the routine, but they also served as a constant reminder of the fragility of their bodies, of the consequences of the work they did. Despite her resigned attitude toward the medical checks, Mary appreciated the security they offered. She knew that in other brothels, the women were not so fortunate. Illness could spread quickly in places where hygiene was neglected, where care was an afterthought. Here at least they were given the chance to remain healthy, to perform at their best. The food, too, was a luxury. Meals were prepared with care, not the meager scraps some brothels provided. They ate hearty stews, fresh bread, and vegetables, meals that were both nourishing and satisfying. It was a comfort, a small one, but one that helped them carry on. Though it was easy to forget, amid the demands of the day, the women were well cared for here. They were given what they needed to survive, even thrive within the limits of the life they led. The brothel's routine, its orderliness, its care, was what allowed the women to keep going. It was the foundation on which everything else rested. For Mary, these small luxuries were what set this place apart from the others. There were no hidden dangers here, no whispers of mistreatment. The clients, though demanding, were never cruel. The women were not exploited in the same way they were in other houses. Mrs. Cartwright kept the brothel in order. Her management impeccable, ensuring that both the women and the clients were treated with respect. This was a business, yes, but it was a business that operated with a level of dignity that was rare in their line of work. And so the morning passed, the routines unfolding one after another, the day stretching out ahead of them like a familiar path. The work would come as it always did, with its demands, its expectations. But for now, there was comfort in the predictability of it all. The brothel, for all its faults, was a place that provided security in a world that often offered none. It was a well-ordered house, a place where the women knew their roles, where the rhythms of life were predictable, where they could rest for a brief moment before the demands of the evening began. As Mary finished her morning duties and prepared for the day ahead, she felt a quiet sense of relief. There would be work, of course. The clients would arrive, and she would play her part, just as she always did. But for now, she could rest in the knowledge that in this world she was cared for. There was a quiet certainty to the weekly medical examinations, a routine as ingrained in the life of the brothel as any other. The doctor's visits were a necessity, a precaution, and perhaps in a way, a reminder of the fragility of the women who worked within the walls of the house. It was a strange sort of ritual one that required the women to submit to an intimate scrutiny of their bodies, but one that at least offered a sense of security. In the world outside, where poverty and neglect often dictated the fate of those with little means, the brothel's attention to health was rare. They knew the value of their workers, the cost of maintaining a well-run establishment, and they were careful to protect the asset that was their livelihood. Mary had learned early on the importance of these exams. They were part of the routine, the rhythm of life within the brothel. At the appointed time each week, the doctor would come. His arrival was not a spectacle, nor was it an event that warranted great attention. It was simply something that happened like the washing and the cleaning and the clients arriving and departing. His visit was as expected as the morning light that filtered through the curtains, the cold air that always seemed to linger in the house despite the hearth fires. The doctor was a middle-aged man, his hair graying at the temples, his hands always steady and precise. He was no stranger to the work that brought the women to this house. He was clinical detached as he went through his examinations. The work he did was necessary, and Mary, like the others, knew it had to be done. There could be no hesitation, no complaint. If there were signs of illness, they had to be addressed immediately. It was not only for the health of the women, but for the safety of the clients as well. The examinations themselves were brief, usually taking only a few minutes per woman. Mary had learned long ago to accept the discomfort, to steel herself against the invasive nature of it. The doctor would check for any signs of disease, an uncomfortable but essential part of the work. His gloved hands, though clinical, always made her feel exposed, as though her body was being measured not by its worth or value, but by its capacity for survival. These examinations, though necessary, served as a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked within the work they did. The diseases that could spread through intimate contact, syphilis, gonorrhea, even tuberculosis, were a real threat, and Mary was always conscious of the fragile nature of her health. It was not only the physical toll of the work, the exhaustion of long hours, the strain of maintaining the delicate balance between service and self-preservation, but the constant fear of falling ill that weighed on her. One slip, one infection, and the consequences could be dire. The doctor's visits, though routine, underscored the risks of their lives. It was a harsh reminder that in this line of work, survival depended not just on endurance, but on constant vigilance. The women who worked in the brothel knew this all too well. A misstep, a lapse in care, and they could be lost not just from the brothel, but from the life they had come to know. If a woman fell ill, she was quickly removed from the work. She might be sent to one of the charitable hospitals, though the treatment there was often less than ideal. In many cases, the women were simply dismissed, no longer fit for work, no longer valuable to the brothel. Mary had seen it happen before. A girl once lively and full of promise, suddenly stricken with illness. Perhaps it was a cough, a rash, something that didn't seem to pass. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Gone to the hospital, or in the worst cases, sent away, her health too fragile to continue in the work. It was a fate that lingered at the back of every woman's mind, a shadow that followed them as they worked. Illness was not just a physical affliction. It was a social death sentence. It meant loss of income, loss of status, loss of everything. For Mary, the fear of becoming ill was almost more pressing than the fear of the stigma that came with her work. She had long ago accepted that society would look down on her, that her place in the world was defined by the work she did. The moral judgment was a constant, a whisper that never quite faded. But the prospect of losing her place at the brothel, of being discarded because her body could no longer perform as it should, was far worse. To lose the job meant to lose herself, to fall into an even worse kind of obscurity, the kind where survival itself was in question. The women who worked here, like Mary, had learned to manage both their physical health and their professional conduct with a kind of quiet precision. They knew what was expected of them, not just in terms of their duties, but in terms of their physicality. To remain healthy, to remain capable of performing, was a matter of survival. And so they followed the doctor's advice. They took care with what they ate, and they made sure to get the rest they could, even if it was little. Every day was an effort to maintain what little control they had over their bodies, over their health. The brothel, for all its faults, had created an environment that offered a sense of security in this aspect at least. The women were not left to their own devices in the harsh world outside. They were given regular medical checks. They were provided with nourishing food, and they were given the chance to stay healthy. It was a small luxury, but it was one that made all the difference in a life where so much else was out of their control. As Mary stood there waiting for the doctor to finish with the others, she reflected on the nature of their existence. The brothel was not a place of comfort, nor was it a place of respect, at least not in the eyes of society. But it was a place where the women could survive, where they could find some measure of safety, even if that safety was fleeting. The small luxuries, good food, medical care, a roof over their heads, were not enough to erase the inherent harshness of their work. But they were enough to keep them going, to keep them alive. The routine of the weekly exams, like everything else in the brothel, was designed to maintain that fragile balance. It was a reminder that the work they did was not just a means of survival. It was a constant battle, a struggle to keep their bodies and their dignity intact. The women who worked here were not just workers, they were survivors. And in this world, survival was the greatest luxury of all. In the world of the brothel, every interaction was a delicate balance, a dance that required both finesse and self-restraint. Mary had learned this dance well, though it had taken time. Each customer was different, each one bringing with them their own desires, their own expectations. Some came seeking only physical release, while others sought something more elusive, emotional connection, companionship, or simply an escape from the mundane realities of their own lives. For Mary, understanding these varied needs was crucial to her survival. She had long since learned that her role in the brothel was not simply to provide physical pleasure. No, she was more than that. She was a confidant, a fantasy, a temporary respite from the world outside. Each customer required something different, and it was up to Mary to discern what that was. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they spoke, in the way they carried themselves. There was always a moment when the true nature of their desire became clear, and it was in that moment that Mary knew how to act, how to respond. Some clients were straightforward. They came in, they paid, and they left seeking little more than physical satisfaction. These men were easy enough to handle. Mary had learned long ago how to give them what they wanted, no more, no less. She had perfected the art of maintaining a polite distance, of performing the necessary tasks, without becoming emotionally involved. She could offer her body, her smile, her charm, but never her heart. That she knew was a line that could never be crossed. Others, however, were more complex. These clients, Mary had learned, were the ones who required more than just a body to satisfy them. They wanted to be listened to be understood. For these men, the brothel was not just a place to seek physical pleasure. It was a refuge from their lives, a place where they could escape, even if only for a short while. Mary had learned to provide that escape, to listen to their stories, to offer the illusion of comfort and understanding. It was in these moments that Mary's role shifted. She was no longer just a woman performing a task. She became a confidant, a temporary companion. She learned to listen, to nod in the right places, to offer the right words of encouragement or sympathy. It was a role she had not expected to take on when she first entered the brothel, but one that had become just as essential to her success as the physical performance. But even in these moments of connection, Mary knew the importance of maintaining control. She could offer comfort, yes, but she could never give more than that. She had learned over time to remain emotionally detached, to protect herself from the men who sought more than what she could give. The brothel was a business after all, and Mary was a worker. The moment she allowed herself to become too involved, she risked losing herself, her sense of self-preservation. The dance between customer and worker was one of subtlety. It required politeness, charm, and the ability to adapt to each man's desires without compromising oneself. The men came in with their own stories, their own burdens, their own needs. Some were lonely, some were tired, some were simply seeking a moment of escape. And Mary, like the other women, had learned to give them that escape, to offer them a brief respite from the weight of their daily lives. She had learned how to be everything they needed her to be without ever losing herself in the process. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant awareness, constant adjustment. She had to be charming, accommodating, and attentive, but never too eager, never too willing to give more than what was expected. She had to be kind, but not too kind. She had to be affectionate, but not too affectionate. There were lines, unspoken and fragile, that she had learned to navigate with quiet precision. It was in these moments, when the dance was at its most intricate, that Mary truly understood the nature of her work. She was not just providing physical pleasure. She was offering something more, something intangible, something that the men would take with them when they left the brothel. She was offering a fantasy, a brief moment of connection in a world that often felt cold and disconnected. And in return, she received her payment, her wage, her survival. But survival was not without its costs. The emotional detachment required for this work, the constant performance of a role, could be exhausting. Mary had learned to compartmentalize, to separate her true self from the woman who performed for the clients. It was the only way to preserve her sense of self, to protect her heart from the constant demands placed upon it. She had seen other women fail their hearts too, open, too willing to connect. Those women Mary had learned were often the ones who burned out first, lost to the work, to the men, to the expectations. And yet, even with all the distance, all the careful control, there were moments when Mary could not help but wonder about the men who came to the brothel. What were their lives like, really? What made them seek this place, this temporary escape? She had seen them all: the businessmen, the sailors, the young men seeking adventure, the older men looking for companionship. Each one was different, but they all shared one thing in common. They came to the brothel to find something they could not find in their ordinary lives. In some ways, they were like her. They were seeking an escape, a way to distance themselves from the weight of the world. And just as she had learned to navigate the brothel's world, they had learned to navigate theirs. They came, and for a few hours, they lived in a world where their desires were the only thing that mattered. For a few hours, they were free from the constraints of society, free from the roles they were expected to play. Mary could not help but feel a certain sympathy for them, even as she maintained the careful distance that her work demanded. She understood their need for escape, their need for something more than what their lives had to offer. But at the same time, she knew that she could not be their salvation. She could only offer them a brief respite, a momentary release. And that, she had learned, was enough. The brothel, despite its grim realities, was a place where fantasy and reality intertwined. The clients came seeking something they could not find in their daily lives, whether it was physical pleasure, emotional connection, or simply a brief escape from the pressures of the world. And in the women who worked there, they found what they were looking for. Mary, like the others, played her part in this delicate dance. She provided what they needed, and in return, she was paid. The exchange was simple and yet complex. The dance was one of subtlety and control, a delicate balance between offering and withholding. Mary had learned it well, perhaps better than some of the others. She knew when to give and when to pull back, when to engage and when to remain distant. It was a dance she had performed countless times with countless men. And though it was a part of her work, it had also become a part of her life, a rhythm, a flow that she moved with day after day. In the quiet moments when the clients had left and the house was still, Mary would sometimes reflect on the nature of her work. She was not just providing physical pleasure, she realized. She was providing an escape, a brief moment of connection in a world that often felt disconnected. The men who came to the brothel were not just seeking her body, they were seeking something more. And in that, Mary found a quiet sense of purpose, however fleeting it may be. But there was always the knowledge lurking in the background that the work was a performance. A part of her would always remain untouched, emotionally distant, for the sake of her survival. She could offer comfort, companionship, even affection, but she could never give more than that. And in that, she found her own form of freedom. The brothel, like any place of work, had its own expectations. The women who worked within it were not just themselves, they were something more. They had to be, for their work demanded it. When a woman entered the room with a client, she was not merely the person she had been moments before. She was an idealized version of femininity, a vision of softness, warmth, and beauty that was meant to fulfill a particular role to meet the desires of the man before her. And in those moments, Mary knew that she must slip into that role, just as she slipped into her dress each day. She had learned this quickly when she first arrived, the shift from the person she was to the person she was expected to be. It wasn't a physical transformation, not one that was immediately obvious at least. No, it was something subtler, something deeper. When the clients came, she was required to wear a mask of sorts, one of charm, of allure, of quiet submission. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about providing an experience and illusion. She had learned to be polite, to smile in a way that invited attention, but did not offer too much. She had learned to listen and laugh at the right moments, to appear engaged and interested, yet not too eager. This was the dance of her work, the delicate balance of performance and detachment. Mary often reflected on the tension between the woman she was outside the brothel and the woman she had to be inside it. It was a strange thing to experience this split between her private self and her professional persona. She had become so accustomed to the demands of her work that sometimes it felt as though she were two different people. The woman who woke in the early mornings, who shared a room with Lily, who spent her days performing the mundane tasks of the brothel, she was one version of Mary. The woman who walked into a room with a client who presented herself as an object of desire, who smiled and laughed and listened with all the right gestures, she was a different version altogether. This split was necessary, for it allowed Mary to do her work without losing herself entirely. She had seen other women, newer girls, younger girls, who had failed to draw that line. They became too involved, too attached to their clients. They lost themselves in the fantasy, in the brief moments of attention and affection, and it was in those moments that the toll of the work became too heavy to bear. The emotional labor involved in this work was tremendous, and it was easy to forget that the men who came seeking comfort would leave their needs met their attention elsewhere, and that the women would be left behind to deal with the aftermath. Mary had learned this lesson early on, and she had resolved not to make the same mistake. She had witnessed it happen to others, how their hearts once open became heavy with attachment, how their smiles became strained, their eyes dimmed with the knowledge of what they were giving up. Some left the brothel, but many stayed worn thin by the emotional toll. And Mary knew she could not afford to let herself slip into that same fate. The emotional distance she kept was not just a coping mechanism, it was a means of survival. It was not that she didn't care for the men who came to her. She could see their loneliness, their desire for something more than what their lives had offered them. She could hear it in their voices, the way they spoke of their troubles, of their hopes, and their regrets. Some were sadder than others, some more desperate. There were those who wanted to talk, those who needed a listening ear, a kind word. And in those moments, Mary would listen. She would offer the illusion of sympathy, of understanding. But she knew better than to let it go further than that. She could offer them a brief respite, a distraction, but she could not offer them more than what she was paid to give. The emotional boundaries she had set for herself had become a shield, one she had learned to carry with quiet pride. It protected her from becoming too entangled in the lives of the men who came to the brothel, and it protected her from the emotional damage that could result from those entanglements. She had seen women become too attached to their clients, become invested in the idea of a relationship that was never going to be. They had given too much of themselves, and in return, they had lost part of their identity. They had left the brothel, but they had never truly left the work. They carried it with them in ways that Mary knew would never heal. And so she kept her distance. It was not coldness, not cruelty. It was self-preservation. She had learned that if she wanted to survive in this world, she had to maintain a part of herself that was untouched, that was her own. The work, the clients, the role she played, these were not her, not the real Mary. And in that knowledge, she found a quiet kind of strength. The boundaries she had set also allowed her to navigate the delicate emotional landscape of the brothel with more ease. She had seen how the other women interacted with one another, how some formed deep, almost familial bonds, while others kept to themselves, their hearts closed off from the rest. There was a camaraderie among them, yes, but it was a camaraderie that was shaped by the work they did, a camaraderie that often served as a shield against the realities of their lives. In the quiet hours when the clients were gone and the house settled into its nighttime rhythm, Mary would sometimes reflect on these relationships, on the strange mix of support and competition that defined the women's interactions. They were all in their way survivors. They had each found a way to endure, to navigate the harsh demands of their work without losing themselves completely. Some found solace in one another's company, while others kept their distance, preferring the quiet isolation of their own thoughts. But no matter the difference in how they navigated the brothel's world, they all shared the same essential truth: they were here to survive. The role they played, the boundaries they set, were all part of that survival. Mary had come to accept this about herself. She was not just a woman in a brothel. She was a performer, a protector of her own heart, a survivor. The emotional labor, the physical, demands the constant balancing act between who she was and who she had to be. It was all part of the work. And it was work that required more than just physical stamina. It required emotional discipline, a constant vigilance against the pull of attachment. But Mary had also learned something else. The distance she kept from her clients, the emotional boundaries she maintained, were not just about protecting herself. They also allowed her to give more. By keeping herself separate, she could offer her clients something that was more genuine, more true to her role. She could be kind, attentive, and supportive, but she could also maintain her own sense of self. In this way, the work did not consume her. She was not lost to it. And in this balance, she found a quiet, steady strength. The brothel, despite its flaws, had taught her. This had taught her how to perform the role she was expected to play while maintaining the core of herself intact. It had taught her the importance of self-preservation, the value of keeping some part of her separate from the demands of the world she inhabited. The work was not easy, but in the distance she kept and the boundaries she drew, she had found a way to survive, a way to endure without losing herself in the process. As the daylight waned and the first hints of twilight crept in through the narrow windows of the brothel, Mary began the transformation that marked the shift from the mundane to the seductive. The evening was approaching, and with it came the clients' men who sought more than just an escape from their daily lives. They sought an experience, one in which the women of the house would embody something beyond the ordinary. The brothel was not just a place for physical release. It was a sanctuary, a world of illusion where the women played roles that had been carefully crafted and honed. Mary had grown used to this ritual, this quiet transformation that had become part of her routine. The shift from simple work to performance was always subtle, but it was there nonetheless. The first step, as always, was the clothing. The plain cotton dress she had worn throughout the day was no longer enough. It had been suitable for cleaning for the brief moments of rest between tasks. But now, it had to be replaced with something more fitting for the role she was about to play. The silk dresses, the fine fabrics, and the corsets. These were the tools of her trade, the garments that allowed her to step into the persona she had learned to embody. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also a mask, a way to become someone else. Someone the clients would desire. Mary knew this well. The corset tightly laced would cinch her waist and accentuate her curves, transforming her figure into the ideal of femininity. The silk dress, soft and flowing, would cling to her in all the right places, giving her the allure of elegance and grace. As she stood before the small mirror, she carefully began the process of dressing. The act was methodical, familiar. She took the pale blue silk gown from the wardrobe, its fabric smooth and cool to the touch. The color was soft, almost ethereal, and it complemented her complexion, pale, but with a faint warmth that spoke of the life she led. She slipped the dress over her head, feeling the fabric settle around her body like a second skin. It was beautiful, but Mary didn't allow herself to linger on the sensation of the silk against her skin. This was not about comfort. This was about presenting herself as the ideal, as the woman the clients had come to see. The corset followed its stiff bones, pressing against her ribs as she carefully laced it up. The tension in her chest was familiar, almost comforting. She tightened the laces slowly, feeling the firm pressure as her waist drew in. The tightness made her breath shallow, but that too was part of the transformation. It was a physical reminder of the role she was to play, the illusion she was about to create. The corset pulled her body into a shape that was both delicate and alluring, a silhouette that met the expectations of those who would soon enter the brothel. Mary adjusted the gown, smoothing the fabric with delicate fingers as she studied her reflection. The dress clung to her figure, its soft folds falling gracefully around her hips. Her hair, once loosely tied back in a simple knot, was now untangled and brushed through. She ran a comb through it, the long, dark strands catching the light. When she was finished, she pinned the hair into an elegant style, soft curls framing her face. She glanced at the mirror again, noting the subtle change in her appearance. She no longer looked like the woman who had risen early to clean and prepare the house. Now, she was someone else. She was the idealized version of femininity, the woman the clients desired, the fantasy they had come for. The transformation, though physical, was not just in the clothing or the way her hair was styled. It was a mental shift, too. She had to leave behind the woman who had spent the day scrubbing floors, dusting furniture, and chatting with the other women. Now, she was someone else entirely. She was the woman who would entertain, who would charm, who would play the role of companion and lover. It was a shift that had become second nature, though it had not always been so. When Mary first entered the brothel, the change had been jarring. It had taken time to learn how to slip into this role, to leave behind the woman who had to scrape by just to survive. But now, it was easy. She had mastered it, just as she had mastered the art of maintaining emotional distance from the work. The distinction between her daytime self and her evening persona was clear, and it was essential to her survival. The morning was spent in the quiet rhythm of chores, cleaning, preparing, resting. The evening, however, was when the work truly began. The clients would arrive, and with them the demands of the job. The women who worked in the brothel were not just there to provide physical satisfaction. They were there to embody the fantasies of the men who came to see them. And in this role, Mary had learned there was little room for personal feelings, for the burdens of her own life. The woman who cleaned and cooked and spoke to the other girls was not the woman who met the client in the evening. That woman was someone else entirely. As the evening drew closer, Mary finished her preparations. She took a moment to check herself in the mirror once more, smoothing the gown over her hips, adjusting the collar to sit just right. She could already hear the faint sounds of the house stirring the clatter of dishes as the kitchen prepared dinner, the soft murmur of voices from the parlor. The first clients would be arriving soon, and she would have to be ready. The women who worked at the brothel had long since learned the importance of this shift, of the necessity of leaving behind the day's routine and stepping into the role they had come to embody. It was more than just putting on the right clothes or styling their hair in a particular way. It was a mental shift, a transformation that allowed them to perform their duties effectively. The men who came to the brothel did not come for the women they saw during the day. They came for the women they wanted to see, the women who were desirable, charming, and untouchable in their allure. Mary had learned this, and she had learned it well. She could step into this role easily now, just as the other women did. They all performed their parts, transforming from the women who cleaned and served into the women who would entertain, who would offer their bodies to the clients. It was an unspoken agreement, a part of the job that each woman had come to accept. The brothel was a place of illusion, a place where the real and the imagined blurred together. The women who worked there embodied the fantasies of their clients, becoming the idealized versions of womanhood, of beauty, of charm. But in doing so, they had to leave their own selves behind, if only for a few hours. The women were not just workers, they were performers playing a role that the clients expected them to play. And in that role they had power. The power to create a world where fantasy was real, where desire could be fulfilled, and where the men who came to the brothel could escape their everyday lives, if only for a while. As Mary finished preparing, she allowed herself a final moment of stillness. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her body settle. She was ready. The evening would unfold, as it always did, and she would play her part with the same practiced ease. It was a performance, yes, but it was one she had learned to master. She would embody the ideal, the fantasy, and for a few hours, she would step into a world that was not her own. With that thought, she turned and left her room, the soft rustle of her silk gown, the only sound in the quiet house. The evening had arrived, and with it, the next performance. As the evening deepened, the brothel came alive with a quiet bustle, the hum of activity replacing the stillness of the morning. The house, now bathed in the warm glow of flickering lamps, had a soft, inviting air to it. The women, having transformed from their daytime selves into their evening personas, moved gracefully through the halls, preparing for the arrival of the first customers. It was this time when the evening's first knocks on the door were heard, that the brothel found its true rhythm. The clients would arrive in dribs and drabs, men who had dined at local establishments or visited the clubs, their desires now turning towards something else. Something that could not be fulfilled in the rigid confines of their everyday lives. They came seeking what the brothel could offer, an escape from the pressures of their world, an illusion of intimacy, an opportunity to indulge their fantasies. For Mary, each encounter was a delicate negotiation, a dance of intimacy and professionalism. She knew by now the exact movements required of her, the precise way to smile, to speak, to position herself. She had learned that each client was different, each one carrying their own needs, desires, and expectations. Some were quiet, their eyes filled with a sadness or loneliness that Mary could sense even before they spoke. Others were eager, their faces flushed with anticipation, their words hurried and sharp. The men who arrived at the brothel were varied, and it was Mary's job to figure out almost instantly what they required from her, what they sought in the brief time they had with her. The dance was subtle, and in many ways it was a performance. Mary had learned to keep her emotions at bay, to offer her smile, her voice, her body, but never her heart. The men who came did not want her true self. They wanted the illusion of something more, a connection, an escape, a fantasy. And so she gave it to them with charm, with grace, with the carefully cultivated persona she had come to embody. Each client, as he entered the parlor, presented a new puzzle to solve, a new set of expectations to navigate. Some wanted only the barest of conversation before the physical act began, their minds already distant, focused on their desires. Others wanted to talk, to share the smallest of details about their lives, their jobs, their families. Some asked for the illusion of affection, the warmth of a touch, a whispered word, a fleeting moment of tenderness. And it was in these moments that Mary had learned to gauge what was needed. Her role was not just to provide physical pleasure. It was to create an environment in which the client could let go of the world outside, if only for an hour or two. She was a vessel for their fantasies, a temporary reprieve from the strictures of their lives. Yet despite the outward warmth, despite the soft smile and the gentle words, there was always a barrier between them, a line that Mary had learned never to cross. The emotional distance was vital to her survival, to her ability to continue with the work day after day. As the evening unfolded, Mary would move through the house with quiet precision, greeting her clients, making sure they were comfortable, ensuring that the scene was set just right. She would walk them to their rooms, guiding them with a gentle hand, a soft laugh, a few words of reassurance. In the room, the space would shift, the atmosphere would change, and Mary would step into the role she was to play, be it the flirtatious woman, the confidant, the lover. Each time she would slip into her persona, as though it were an old, familiar coat, one that fit perfectly, that she knew how to wear without thinking. It was not always easy. The work, despite its outward simplicity, was exhausting. The emotional energy required to maintain the distance, to provide the illusion of connection, without becoming emotionally entangled, was draining. Each encounter, though brief, took something from her, even if she did not allow herself to acknowledge it. She would smile, she would laugh, She would offer her body and her charm, but underneath it all, there was a quiet cost. The brothel's routine was one of predictability. Each night would follow the same pattern, a few men arriving early, a few more coming later, each interaction unfolding in much the same way. The dance was always the same, and Mary had long since perfected it. Yet despite the routine, each encounter felt different, unique in its own way. She could never truly predict what each man would bring to the table, what he would need from her, what he would leave behind. Some men left quickly, their business finished in moments, their faces already fading from her memory. Others lingered, their time stretched longer, their desires more complex. And it was in these moments of lingering that Mary found the most difficulty. In the early days of her work, the longer encounters had unsettled her. She had not yet learned the art of maintaining the distance, of keeping herself emotionally untouched. But over time, she had learned to navigate these longer meetings with quiet grace. She learned how to listen, how to offer comfort without giving too much of herself. She had learned that the emotional investment she might offer would not be reciprocated in the way she wished. The men were not here for her. They were here for the woman she portrayed, the illusion she presented. And so, with each passing hour, she gave them what they wanted, even as she kept her heart apart, locked away behind the walls she had built. The routine was in some ways comforting. It was a world she knew well, a world where she understood the expectations and the rules. The men would come, they would pay, they would leave, and the cycle would begin again. The brief moments of connection, though never real, were enough to carry her through the night, enough to make her feel like she was offering something of value, even if that value was only the fleeting pleasure she could provide. Yet there were always moments, small, quiet moments, when Mary allowed herself to reflect. She would sit alone in the room, after the client had left her body tired, but not yet at rest, and she would wonder. She would wonder what the men were really seeking, what they truly wanted from her. The questions never had answers, not truly. They were just fleeting thoughts, questions that could not be asked, not in this world. And so she would push them aside, just as she had learned to push away the tenderness that sometimes crept into her heart. The brothel, like the rest of her life, was a performance. It was a place where illusions were crafted, where the women who worked there became vessels for the fantasies of others. But even in the midst of the performance, Mary could see the cracks. She could see the ways in which the clients were just as lost as she was, just as hungry for something they could not have. Perhaps that was why they came here, to find something, to feel something, to escape from the lives they had built. But for Mary, there was no escaping. This was her life now, and the dance would continue. As the night wore on, the last clients would filter out of the brothel, their needs met, their desires fulfilled. The house would quiet once more, and Mary would retire to her room, tired but not yet ready to rest. The night had taken its toll on her, as it always did, and the hours of emotional labor would catch up with her eventually. But for now, there was a moment of peace, a brief respite before the cycle would begin again. In the quiet moments of the night, Mary would reflect, as she always did, on the work she did, the life she led. It was a strange existence, one that she had never imagined for herself, but it was hers, and she had learned how to survive it. The dance of pleasure, of fantasy, of illusion. It was her job now, her means of survival. And as long as she kept her distance, kept her emotions in check, she would continue to perform. The business of pleasure would go on, and she would be there ready to dance once again. The brothel, for all its hardships, was both a place of confinement and, strangely, a place of freedom. For Mary and the other women who worked there, it was a paradox, a world where their bodies were used and judged, yet also a place where they could secure the means to survive, to carve out some semblance of agency in a society that often offered them none. They were women whose worth was measured not by their intellect, kindness, or creativity, but by their beauty, their charm, and their ability to perform. Yet within the walls of this brothel, Mary discovered a sense of independence and control, a control she had never known before. In this life, survival was the only constant, and Mary had learned to navigate it with quiet grace despite the emotional and physical toll it took. The work, though often dehumanizing, provided economic independence, a rare commodity for women in Victorian society. She could make her own decisions, earn her own living, and in a world where women were often denied basic freedoms, this was no small thing. But this independence came at a steep price. The emotional labor of the work, of constantly performing, of constantly offering a part of herself without ever fully giving it, was a weight she carried in quiet moments. It was not a life of joy, but one of necessity, one that required constant vigilance, constant control. Though the work was full of stigma, full of judgment from those outside the brothel, Mary had come to realize that the very nature of her existence in this space offered a certain protection. She and the other women had created their own world within the brothel, a world where they could exist on their own terms. Yes, they were confined by their roles, their society's views of them, but within the walls of the brothel, they were granted certain freedoms. They were allowed to earn to live independently, and most importantly, they had each other. There was camaraderie among them, a deep bond formed by their shared experiences, and this bond, however complicated by competition and rivalry, was often the only emotional support they had in a world that sought to erase them. Mary reflected often on the paradox of it all. While the brothel and the work it entailed was seen as shameful by society, it also allowed her to step outside the confines of poverty. Her independence, her ability to survive, was not granted by a society that offered her nothing but harsh choices. No, she had carved her own way, made her own place in the world by becoming what was required. And it was in this quiet, painful self-preservation that Mary found strength. It was not glamorous. It was not what anyone would have chosen, least of all Mary. But it was survival. And survival, she had learned, was the most important thing. In navigating the brothel's world, Mary also learned the delicate art of balance. The emotional toll of the work was perhaps the heaviest cost. She had learned to detach, to keep part of herself reserved for the moments when she would need it most. The boundary between who she was and the role she had to play was crucial. She knew she could never fully engage with the men who came to the brothel, for to do so would risk losing herself entirely. The illusion they sought was one that she provided with skill, charm, attentiveness, warmth. But it was just that, an illusion. She could never allow it to be anything more. And so, she played her part day after day, night after night. But it was not without cost. Even as she learned to distance herself, she still longed for something deeper, a connection, a true bond. In fleeting moments, she would catch a glimpse of what might have been, of a life where her worth was not defined by her appearance or her ability to charm, but by who she was beneath it all. But those moments were few and far between, fading quickly as reality set back in. For now, survival was the only focus. There was no room for dreams of a different life. Not in the brothel. Not in the world she inhabited. And yet, despite all this, Mary had learned to find moments of quiet solace. The small acts of kindness between the women, the shared laughter, the moments of rest in between clients, these were the things that made it bearable. She had built a life in the brothel, one that was as controlled as the performances she gave each night. And while it was a life fraught with sacrifice, it was hers. She had made her peace with it, found a kind of quiet acceptance in the work. There were no illusions about what it was or what it could be, but in this life, she had found a way to exist, to endure. Through the lens of this life, Mary had come to understand both her own personal struggles and the larger societal forces that shape the lives of women like her. She had come to see that her role, though painful and often degrading, was also a complex system of survival and self-preservation. The brothel, in its own way, had allowed her to maintain a certain sense of control, a certain independence. It was a place where the women were valued for their work, where they were given the tools to survive in a world that rarely acknowledged their existence. But that survival came at a high cost, emotional, physical, and moral. The lines between right and wrong blurred, and Mary, like the others, had learned to navigate them with quiet precision. As Mary moved through her days, she came to accept that the cost of survival was a price she had to pay. The brothel, with all its harshness and its small comforts, had become her world. She had made her place within it, and though the work took its toll, she had learned to find peace in the quiet moments. It was not a life of luxury, nor was it a life of ease. But it was a life that allowed her to endure, to survive, to carve out a space for herself in a world that had so often denied her the chance to do so. So, as the story of Mary's life in the brothel draws to a close, I thank you for following along. It is a story of survival, of quiet resilience in the face of immense challenges. It is a story of a woman who has learned to navigate a world of hardship, who has learned to balance the demands of survival with the need to protect herself. And while her journey is not one of grand triumph, it is a journey of endurance, of self-preservation, and of finding small moments of connection in a world that often seems devoid of them. If you found this story compelling, I invite you to share your thoughts. Please like, share, and comment below. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, and I love hearing your reflections. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May you find peace and solace in your own path, just as Mary found in hers.